Good evening, I'm Abe.
And my name is Frank. Today, we'll be animating the first half of Chapter 35, America in World War II, in Bailey, Kennedy, and Cohen's The American Pageant textbook. Abe, would you like to start us off?
I would. In the wake of war, most Americans cried, "Get Japan first!" However, in the ABC-1 agreement with Britain, the US formally agreed to the strategy of defeating Germany first. The US was the most powerful military power in the world, but the challenge was that it had to quickly adapt itself for all-out war production before the Axis powers crushed Britain and the USSR. America not only had to feed, arm, and transport its own troops, but it also had to send food and munitions to its allies. Now, Frank, how did Pearl Harbor affect America?
Well, in the wake of the Pearl Harbor attack, the entire nation was drawn together to face the threat from the Axis powers. There was one exception to this we're all in the same boat mentality, however. The Japanese, 110,000 of whom lived on the West Coast, were all suspected of being spies for Japan. In Executive Order 9066, they were placed into military camps in a move which drastically undermined the American justice mentality of innocent until proven guilty. Back in Washington, D.C., politicians began repealing New Deal legislation and enacting laws to boost the war effort. By and large, World War II was not the campaign to, quote, make the world safe for democracy, as World War I had been. The Allies had one clear objective only: not to spread democracy, but simply to win the war. But Abe, can you tell me more about how war production increased in order to fight against the Axis?
Yes, the War Production Board was established, which managed factories to produce enormous amounts of weaponry. The WPB also ceased the production of non-essential products, such as passenger cars, and the US government imposed a national speed limit and began to ration gasoline. Furthermore, the Office of Price Administration regulated prices and prevented them from soaring too high, and the National War Labor Board set maximums on wage increases. Since labor unions were strongly opposing the wage ceilings and many workers were abandoning their jobs, Congress passed the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act, which allowed the federal government itself to operate industries threatened by strikes. Now, Frank, how did all this war production affect America's economy?
Well, the military actually created 15 million jobs, of which 216,000 were for women. These were primarily found in the WAAC, the WAVES, and SPAR, all of which allowed women to serve in some capacity in the military for the first time ever. Additionally, more than 6 million women began to work in industrial jobs outside the home, though at the end of the war, 2/3 of these women left the labor force. As so many American men and women joined the army or industrial jobs, the shortage of agricultural workers was cured by the Bracero program, in which thousands of Mexican workers were brought into the country to harvest crops, such as fruit or grain, inside California. Abe, can you tell me how World War II affected the demographics of the United States?
Yes, many American soldiers decided to not return to their homes at the end of World War II. Instead, many migrated to LA, Detroit, Baton Rouge, Seattle, and California. Roosevelt also accelerated the economic development of the South after the war by granting it larger defense contracts. Furthermore, race relations became a national issue rather than a regional issue, since many blacks left the South and went west and north. By 1970, almost half the black population lived outside of the South. After A. Philip Randolph, a black leader, threatened to march on Washington to demand equality for blacks in armed forces and war jobs, Roosevelt established the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which forbade discrimination in war industries. Overall, the war helped to incite blacks to demand equality, and the Congress of Racial Equality, dedicated to nonviolent direct action, was also established. Not only did the war affect blacks, but it also affected Native Americans. Many Native Americans moved to cities and others became code talkers, using their native languages as a secret code to transmit messages. Now, Frank, did the war have any effect on the Great Depression?
You know it, Abe. The war conquered the Depression once and for all. It also increased GDP by 200% and doubled the disposable income in American families. World War II was also costly at $330 billion, or twice as much as all previous spending from the federal government combined. To pay for this, the income tax was expanded to catch 4 times as many people, and tax rates rose to as much as 90% of income for some individuals. In the wake of Pearl Harbor, did Japan continue its aggression?
It did. At the same time as their strike on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attacked Wake, Guam, the Philippines, and other outposts in Southeast Asia. By seizing Burma, the Japanese now forced the Americans to fly their supplies over the Himalayas and into China. In the Philippines at Bataan, the Japanese faced off against American General Douglas MacArthur and eventually forced him to surrender. The remaining American troops at Bataan were forced on the 80-mile Bataan Death March, the first of many atrocities in the savage Pacific War. Now, Frank, how did Japan continue in its war effort against the United States?
Well, the Japanese continued to expand rapidly, reaching as far as New Guinea in the south and the Solomon Islands in the east, where they even threatened Australia. They even invaded some of the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska. Their expansion was finally checked at Coral Sea, and the tide was turned during the Battle of Midway, where the Japanese lost 4 crucial aircraft carriers in 3 days. Abe, can you tell me even more about Japan?
I would love to. The Americans adopted an island hopping strategy for the Japanese-controlled islands in the Pacific, in which the Americans would neutralize island after island as they moved towards Tokyo, but the Americans would skip over the most heavily fortified Japanese posts. Very valuable to the Americans were the Mariana Islands, since these islands could be used as a strategic base for American B-29 super bombers to attack Japan's home islands. Eventually, by 1944, Americans had captured enough Pacific islands to maintain around-the-clock bombing on Japan. Now, Frank, I'm sick of talking about Japan. Can you tell me about the important guy?
Adolf Hitler? Well, from the start, Hitler's U-boats were taking a heavy toll on Allied shipping to the UK, or Great Britain. But the tide began to turn as the US and British began to use convoys, depth charges, radar, and the cracking of the German Enigma code to their advantage. By 1942, the Allies had gained superiority over the German airspace, and heavy bombing began, launched from airfields inside Great Britain. Under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Nazis had conquered much of North Africa, but were stopped by British General Montgomery at El Alamein in Egypt. Montgomery then drove the Germans back thousands of miles, all the way to Tunisia. Back on the Eastern Front, the Russians halted the Nazi advance in the Battle of Stalingrad, and from there, the Russians began a counteroffensive, driving the Germans back to Berlin. Thank you for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe.
And comment down below if you have any questions.
We'll catch you guys, as ever, next time.